The silence is the first thing you register. It is not an empty silence, but a heavy, weighted presence that presses in on you from all sides. It is the silence of cold stone, thick tapestries, and unspoken rules. You have been standing in this antechamber of the Royal Alcázar of Madrid for over 2 hours, and the only permissible sound is the rustle of your own stiff, black clothing. Your spine is a column of fire, but you dare not shift your weight. To do so would be to draw a glance, and a glance is a judgment. Through the far doors you know the king. Philip IV is performing the ritual of his midday meal. This is not a private act of sustenance. It is a public sacrament, witnessed by a select few whose proximity to the royal person is measured in inches and lifetimes of service. You are a courtier, a minor piece in this vast, intricate clockwork of power. Your function is not to act, but to be present, to occupy your designated space in the tableau of majesty, to affirm the cosmic order with your stillness. To cough would be a political statement. To falter would be a confession of weakness. In the Spanish Habsburg court, existence is performance, and the script is etched into the very stones beneath your feet. The system that governed the Spanish court of the 16th and 17th centuries was known as the Burgundian Ceremonial. It was a rigid, unyielding code of etiquette inherited from the opulent and highly structured court of the Dukes of Burgundy. Imported into Spain by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, it was his son, Philip I, who perfected it into an instrument of absolute control. Where other European courts, like that of France, might cultivate an atmospheric conversation and social intrigue, the Spanish court was a theatre of somber gravity. It was less a royal residence and more a secular monastery, with the monarch as its remote and inaccessible abbot. The Royal Alcázar in Madrid and the forbidding granite palace monastery of El Escorial were its primary stages. These were not places designed for comfort or intimacy, but as physical manifestations of a divinely ordained hierarchy. The king's life was tomatized into a series of public rituals. His waking, the levee, was a ceremony. His dressing, a procedure attended by the highest-ranking nobles, each with a specific, unalterable role. His meals were public spectacles, eaten in complete silence, where every gesture was freighted with meaning. His processions through the palace's long, cold corridors were choreographed down to the last step. This relentless ceremonial served a crucial political purpose. It mystified the monarch, elevating him from a mere man to a living icon, the terrestrial embodiment of the Spanish Empire itself. His body was sacred, a political object that did not belong to him. According to contemporary accounts, to touch the king without permission, even accidentally, was an offense that could have severe consequences. A courtier who once helped King Philip I, when his horse stumbled, was reportedly exiled from court for the transgression of laying a hand upon the royal person. This created a profound and deliberate isolation. The king was separated from the world by a series of concentric circles of access. To reach him, a petitioner or courtier had to navigate a labyrinth of antechambres, each guarded by officials of increasing rank, from the gentleman of the chamber to the powerful sumiller decor, the master of the king's household. Each door represented a new level of exclusion, reinforcing the immense distance between the ruler and the ruled. The atmosphere within these inner sanctuments was one of hushed reverence and perpetual observation. Courtiers communicated in low whispers, their movements slow and deliberate. The mandated court attire, almost exclusively black, absorbed the light and added to the pervading sense of solemnity and austerity, a visual reflection of the counter-Reformation piety that defined the Habsburg dynasty. This environment was a gilded cage in the most literal sense. It trapped not only the king but the entire upper echelon of the Spanish nobility. By requiring their constant presence at court to participate in these often tedious rituals, the monarch kept his most powerful and potentially rebellious subjects under direct supervision. Their ambition was channeled away from plotting provincial rebellions and into the vicious, silent struggle for courtly precedence, the right to hand the king his glove, to hold a candle during a ceremony, or to occupy a specific spot in a procession. It was a system that sublimated political power into symbolic capital, making proximity to the monarch the ultimate currency. In this world of rigid control, Every human interaction was scripted, every relationship defined by rank and protocol. It was a sterile, predictable, and deeply lonely universe. And it was into this precise environment, so devoid of genuine, spontaneous human connection, that a very different kind of courtier would be introduced, not for their adherence to the rules, but for their very exemption from them. Within this calcified social structure where every individual was a cog in a machine of state, there existed a deep-seated fascination with its opposite. The anomaly, the thing that defied the natural order. This was not a uniquely Spanish preoccupation but a pan-European intellectual current of the Renaissance and Baroque periods. The era was defined by a profound taxonomic impulse, a desire to collect, categorize and understand the entirety of God's creation. Monarchs and aristocrats across the continent competed to assemble what were known as wonder camerae, or cabinets of curiosities. These collections were encyclopedic in their ambition, miniature theaters of the world designed to showcase the owner's wealth, intellect, and grasp of the cosmos. They were divided into categories: natural IA, which included strange geological formations, exotic shells, and taxiderm-i.e. animals, artificial IA, marvels of human craftsmanship like intricate automata and carved ivory, and exotica, objects brought back from the newly explored territories of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The ultimate expression of this collecting mania, however, was not an inanimate object, but a living human being. The Spanish Habsburgs, rulers of a global empire, sought to make their court a living wonder camera, a microcosm of their worldwide dominion. They systematically acquired individuals whose physical forms were considered prodigies of nature. Surviving household accounts and diplomatic correspondence reveal a concerted effort to populate the palaces with a menagerie of human marvels. This collection included giants, individuals with acromegaly or pituitary gigantism, whose towering frames were a source of awe. It included those with hypertrichosis, a condition causing excessive hair growth over the body, the most famous example being the family of Petrus Gonsalvus, whose portraits were circulated among the courts of Europe. It also included individuals with albinism, conjoined twins, and those with various intellectual and developmental differences, who were often categorized under the broad and imprecise term of locos or fools. These individuals were not employed in the traditional sense. They were acquired. They were located by royal agents, purchased from families, or, most commonly, exchanged between rulers as living diplomatic gifts. A German prince might send a particularly notable dwarf to the King of Spain to carry favor, just as he might send a prized falcon or an expertly crafted clock. Their value was intrinsically tied to their rarity and the distinctiveness of their physical condition. They were entered into the household inventories. They were provided with lavish clothing, comfortable lodgings, and their own servants. But their status was fundamentally paradoxical. They were simultaneously pampered pets and human property, living ornaments whose primary function was to exist as objects of spectacle and wonder. Their presence served as a constant, visible testament to the monarch's power. It was a statement that the King of Spain's reach was so absolute that he not only commanded armies and territories but could also possess the very exceptions to nature's laws. They were paraded during formal receptions and banquets, their physical otherness serving as a dramatic foil to the rigid conformity of the courtiers. The sight of a giant standing beside a dwarf was a popular visual trope, a living embodiment of the sublime and the grotesque that so fascinated the Baroque imagination. Their presence reinforced the natural order by showcasing its apparent transgression. The king, by surrounding himself with these unnatural bodies, reaffirmed his own position as the pinnacle of the natural, divinely ordained hierarchy. They were mirrors that, by reflecting an inverse or distorted image of humanity, magnified the ideal form of the monarch. However, within this diverse collection of human curiosities, one group came to occupy a distinct and far more complex role. While giants and other marvels were often objects of transient astonishment, court dwarfs were integrated into the very fabric of daily royal life. Their small stature, which in the outside world was a source of disadvantage and ridicule, became, within the unique ecosystem of the court, the key to an unprecedented form of intimacy and influence. They were not merely for looking at, they were for interacting with, for talking to, for trusting. Over time, they transitioned from being simple items in the royal collection to becoming indispensable companions to the most isolated and powerful individuals in the world. Their story is not one of passive spectacle, but of active, strategic survival within the gilded cage. The foundation of the court dwarfs' unique position within the Habsburg hierarchy rests upon a profound and exploitable paradox. Their power was a direct consequence of their perceived powerlessness. In a world where influence was measured by titles, land, military command, and noble lineage, they possessed none. They were, in the strictest legal and social sense, non-entities. They could not inherit, they could not formally participate in the grand theatre of governance. And it was precisely this complete and visible lack of conventional power that made them so uniquely potent. They were the exception to every rule, and in the rigid, airless environment of the Spanish court, the exception was the only space where a different kind of influence could germinate. To the courtiers who navigated the treacherous currents of royal favor, the dwarfs were functionally invisible as rivals. A duke might fear the rising influence of a marquis, a royal secretary might guard his position jealously against an ambitious subordinate. All these men were players in the same ruthless game, competing for the same finite resources of wealth and royal esteem. A court dwarf, however, was not in the game. Their physical stature rendered them not threatening in a culture that equated masculinity and authority with physical presence and martial prowess. No one feared a physical challenge from them. More importantly, their social status placed them outside the established lines of ambition. They were not seeking a governorship, a military commission, or a seat on the Council of State. Their rewards came in the form of fine clothes, a larger ration of wine, or a favored position near the royal hearth. This apparent modesty of their desires led the true paradoxer of the court to dismiss them as little more than human furniture, amusing distractions with no bearing on the serious matters of state. This dismissal was a profound strategic error. The infantilization of the court dwarfs, who were often referred to with diminutive nicknames and treated as perpetual children, was the very key that unlocked the most restricted doors of the palace. Courtiers, ministers, and visiting ambassadors, so guarded in their speech amongst their peers, would speak with alarming candor in the presence of a dwarf. They assumed the dwarf was either incapable of understanding the complexities of their conversation or, if they did understand, had no means of leveraging that information. They were the living equivalent of a concealed listening device, sitting quietly in the corner of a room while secret negotiations were conducted, treasonous sentiments were whispered, or the king's private psychological state was being assessed by his closest advisors. Every secret they overheard, every observation they made of a courtier's true demeanor when the mask of formality slipped, was stored away. This invisibility cloak of perceived harmlessness was paired with a level of physical access to the monarch that was unparalleled. While the highest-ranking noble in Spain, the sumiller de cour might have the ceremonial duty of attending the king's dressing, his interactions were circumscribed by ritual. The court dwarf, by contrast, was often present in the king's private chambers long before the formal ceremonies of the day began and long after they ended. They were there in moments of royal illness, fatigue, and private rage. They witnessed the monarch not as a living statue but as a human being. This unfiltered intimacy was the crucible of their influence. The king, suffocated by the sycophancy and constant petitioning of his courtiers, found in the dwarf a companion with whom he could theoretically speak plainly. The dwarf was not a competitor. Their survival and comfort were entirely dependent on the king's personal affection, not on political maneuvering. This created the potential for a bond that, while grotesquely asymmetrical, felt more genuine to the isolated monarch than any he could form with his own nobles. Herein lies the central thesis of their hidden history. The very mechanisms of their objectification became the instruments of their power. Their status as property removed them from the field of political rivalry. Their role as entertainers gave them a license to speak with a frankness forbidden to others. Their physical non-threatening nature allowed them to blend into the background, becoming unseen observers. Intimate proximity to the king gave them the one thing every courtier craved above all else, the monarch's seer in his most unguarded moments. They were the court's great secret, wielding a soft power that operated outside of all official channels. It was a power based not on command, but on knowledge, not on authority, but on access, not on a carefully cultivated dependency. But before they could wield this influence, they first had to arrive at its center. Their journey to the court was a story in itself, a testament to the methodical and far-reaching nature of the royal collecting impulse. The acquisition of these individuals was not a matter of chance or happenstance. It was a systematic, often competitive, and highly organized endeavor that reflected the vast administrative reach of the Spanish crown. The process of populating the court with human marvels was as deliberate as the procurement of silver from the Americas or fine silks from the East. It operated through several distinct and well-established channels, each of which underscored the status of the individuals in question as valuable, rare commodities. The journey to the heart of the empire began not with a choice, but with a discovery and a transaction, stripping them of their prior identity, undercasting them as appendages to royal grandeur. The most prestigious channel of acquisition was diplomatic exchange. In the intricate web of European dynastic politics, the gift of a court dwarf was a gesture of profound respect and a subtle display of influence. Rulers across Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Low Countries understood the Habsburgs' peculiar taste for such companions. A monarch wishing to gain favor with the Spanish king might dispatch an agent to locate a particularly well-proportioned or intelligent dwarf to be sent to Madrid as a living offering. Such a gift was considered more personal and more thoughtful than a simple offering of jewels or art. It demonstrated an intimate understanding of the recipient's desires and a willingness to part with a valuable asset. The arrival of a new dwarf from a foreign court was a significant event, and their provenance added to their mystique and value, talking symbols of the political ties that bound the continent's ruling houses. Beyond these high-level exchanges, the Spanish crown maintained its own proactive network for identifying and securing potential candidates. Provincial governors, regional administrators, and even local clergy were tacitly expected to act as talent scouts. A report sent to the capital detailing a tax dispute might contain a postscript noting the birth of an unusually small child to a peasant family in a remote village. Royal physicians and ambassadors traveling on official business were also tasked with keeping an eye out for individuals who would be suitable for the court collection. This created a vast, informal intelligence network that funneled information about human anomalies from the farthest corners of the empire and beyond towards the central court. Once a promising individual was identified, a formal process of inquiry would begin. This process often culminated in a direct transaction with the individual's family. For families in the lower strata of society, the birth of a child with dwarfism could be both a social stigma and a severe economic burden. The arrival of a royal agent, dressed in the livery of the king and offering financial compensation, would have been a momentous and often irresistible event. While historical records are often discreet about the exact nature of these arrangements, surviving account books list payments made to families for the care and upbringing of a child, which effectively functioned as a purchase price. From the family's perspective, this was not necessarily an act of cruelty. It was a pragmatic choice that offered the child a life of unimaginable material comfort and security, far from the public ridicule and poverty that would likely have been their fate otherwise. In their eyes, they were not selling their child, but securing their future in the only way available to them. Once the arrangement was made, the individual began their long journey to the court. They were transported with the care befitting a precious object, often accompanied by a dedicated attendant. Upon arrival in Madrid, they were formally presented to the monarch and the masters of the royal household. They would be inspected, their physical characteristics noted, and their intellect and temperament assessed. If deemed acceptable, they were officially integrated into the court structure. They were often given a new name or a nickname, a symbolic act that severed the final tie to their previous life and marked their rebirth as a possession of the crown. They were then turned over to the royal tailors to be outfitted in luxurious, scaled-down versions of court attire, and assigned quarters within the palace. From that moment forward, their life was no longer their own. It was a life defined by a new and economic status of privilege, yet fundamentally unfree, member of the king's household. Upon entering the palace, the individual ceased to exist as an independent entity and was reborn as an asset on the royal household's meticulous ledgers. Their legal and financial status was a complex tapestry of privilege and subjugation, a carefully calibrated state of existence that ensured both their material comfort and their absolute dependency. They were not classified as slaves in the manner of those brought to labor in the colonies, a distinction the court's jurists would have carefully maintained. Instead, they occupied a unique, liminal space within the vast and hierarchical structure of the royal household, the real Cosa y Patrimonio de la Corona de España. They became part of the monarch's extended familia, a medieval concept that encompassed not just blood relatives, but all dependents, servants, and retainers who lived under the king's roof and protection. To be part of this familia was to be both cared for and owned by its patriarch. Their compensation was not a salary, for a salary implies a contractual agreement between free parties. It was rather a series of carefully itemized provisions and allowances, recorded with bureaucratic precision by the household administrators. The primary form of this was the ración or daily ration. Surviving documents in the palace archives detail these allocations with painstaking clarity. Each court dwarf was entitled to a specific quantity of bread, meat, fish, wine, oil, vinegar, and, crucially, candles for their quarters. The quality and quantity of these rations far exceeded that available to the general populace, and often rivaled that of mid-ranking court officials. They were also granted specific yearly allowances known as gays for incidental expenses. This system ensured they were well-fed, well-housed, and wanted for nothing in terms of basic sustenance. This material security was the first and most fundamental chain in their gilded cage. Perhaps the most visible manifestation of their status was their wardrobe. The king's tailors, the same artisans who dressed the royal family, were tasked with creating their clothing. Account books are filled with entries for bolts of Italian velvet, French silk, and fine woolen cloth, all destined for the diminutive figures of the court. Their garments were not merely functional, they were elaborate, scaled-down replicas of the opulent fashions worn by the highest nobility. This was a calculated investment. The dwarf, dressed in finery that a provincial nobleman could only dream of, became a walking advertisement for the monarch's bottomless wealth and largesse. Their resplendent appearance was a reflection not of their own worth, but of their owners. When a foreign ambassador saw a dwarf in a suit of shimmering silk, the intended message was clear. The King of Spain could afford to dress even his human pets in a manner that surpassed the visitor's own. In addition to these provisions, high-status dwarfs who earned the particular affection of the monarch or the royal children might be granted further privileges. They could be assigned their own personal servants, a clear marker of their elevated position within the household hierarchy. They might receive gifts of money or valuable objects on feast days or to mark special occasions. In some documented cases, upon their retirement due to old age or infirmity, they were granted a small pension to ensure their continued care, a recognition of their long and loyal service. This created a powerful incentive for unwavering obedience and a constant effort to remain in the royal favor. Yet for all this material comfort, their lack of autonomy was absolute. They could not leave the confines of the palace or its grounds without explicit permission. They had no right to choose their own associates or pursue personal endeavors. Perhaps most significantly, their right to form a family of their own was almost entirely non-existent. A marriage would have introduced a catastrophic legal complication into the clean lines of ownership and dependency. Who would their allegiance belong to? Who would have a claim on their children? To the court, it was an unthinkable disruption of the established order. Their lives were entirely circumscribed by the whims of their royal master. They could be loaned to a favored noble for a period of time or, as was often the case, be given as a permanent gift to a departing royal bride as she left Spain to marry into another European dynasty. They were pieces to be moved on the great chessboard of European politics, their personal desires a complete non-factor. This total economic and legal subjugation created the perfect conditions for a strange and unprecedented form of psychological reliance, not from their side alone, but most critically from the monarch himself. To understand the unique function of the court dwarf, one must first deconstruct the psychology of the absolute monarch they served. The Spanish Habsburg king of the 16th and 17th centuries was not merely a ruler. He was the central axis around which the entire Spanish imperium revolved. He was, as described by the political theory of the day, the head of the corpus mysticum, the mystical body of the state. This elevation came at a staggering personal cost, a profound and inescapable human isolation. The Burgundian Ceremonial, as detailed, was an instrument designed to create distance, to transform a man of flesh and blood into a remote, semi-divine symbol. The consequence of this deification was the creation of an environment entirely devoid of authentic human connection. The king lived his life within a suffocating parallax of observation and performance. Every person he encountered, from the highest grandee to the lowliest page, had a specific and calculated role to play. More importantly, every single one of them, without exception, wanted something from him. Their conversations were petitions disguised as pleasantries. Their loyalty was a currency spent to acquire titles, lands, pensions, or appointments for their relative. The air the king breathed was thick with obsequiousness, with the silent, desperate clamor of ambition. In this sycophantic ecosystem, a genuine, disinterested word was an impossibility. The monarch was the loneliest man in his kingdom, surrounded by thousands but perpetually alone with the crushing weight of his office. He could trust no one, for every advisor had their own faction, every minister their own agenda. It was into this psychological void that the court dwarf was inserted. Their unique value was not in their wit or their appearance, but in their structural inability to participate in the game of courtly ambition. As established, they were possessions, not players. Their complete dependency, which defined their legal status, became their greatest psychological asset. The king knew that the dwarf kneeling at his feet was not angling for a military command in Flanders or a viceroyalty in Peru. Their ambition was limited to the confines of the palace, a kinder word, a sweeter delicacy from the royal table, a warmer spot by the fire. This removed the transcational poison that tainted all the king's other relationships. With the dwarf, the monarch could, for brief, precious moments, cease to be the king. He could lower the mask of impassive majesty. The infantilization of the dwarfs by the court played a crucial role here. In treating them as perpetual children, the king was given license to act as something other than a stern father to his kingdom. In their company, he could display emotions forbidden in the presence of his council: frustration, weariness, even a flicker of mirth. They became the custodians of the king's hidden, private self. They saw him not during the public ritual of the royal dinner, but afterwards in his chambers, when the heavy robes of state were removed. They were present in moments of sickness, when the divine body was racked with very human pain, and in moments of grief, when dynastic tragedy struck. This created a psychological sanctuary. The dwarfs' quarters, or their designated spot within the king's own chambers, became one of the few places in the entire palace where the monarch did not have to perform. Their conversation, whether it was simple gossip or witty observation, or even just a shared silence, was a respite from the world of coded language and political intrigue. Because they were perceived as harmless, their observations were often startlingly direct. Lacking the sophisticated political filter of a courtier, their comments on people or events could provide the king with a shard of unvarnished, if simplistic, truth. They were a sounding board that did not echo back a carefully crafted flattery. This asymmetrical bond between the most powerful man in the world and the most legally powerless became a strange and vital dependency. The king, who owned the dwarf's body, became reliant on the dwarf for his own psychological equilibrium. So private and yet so politicificant would find its most enduring testament not in Chronicles, which recorded the public acts of kings, but on canvas, under the revolutionary gaze of a court painter who saw them not as props but as people. The official archives of the Spanish court, the endless ledgers detailing expenditures on wine, silk, and candle wax, provide the skeleton of the court dwarf's existence. They tell us that these individuals lived, ate, and were clothed in luxury. But these records are silent on the one question that truly matters. Who were they? To find the answer, we must turn from the written accounts of the bureaucrat to the visual testimony of the artist. Specifically to one artist, Diego Rodriguez de Silva y Velázquez, the undisputed master of the Spanish Golden Age and the court painter to King Philip IV. In his hands, the paintbrush became a tool of radical humanization, creating a record that stands in stark opposition to the official role of his subjects as mere objects of amusement. Before Velázquez, the artistic tradition for depicting individuals with dwarfism was largely allegorical or decorative. In medieval and Renaissance art, they often appeared at the margins of grand compositions, their presence serving to enhance the status and physical perfection of their noble masters. They were symbols, not subjects. They were frequently depicted in grotesque or comical postures, their humanity subsumed by their function as a living curiosity and accessory to power. The art reflected the social reality, they were part of the scenery, not the story. When Velázquez was appointed court painter in 1623, he inherited this tradition. However, he did not continue it. He shattered it. Velázquez's approach to portraiture was revolutionary in its commitment to unvarnished realism or verdad truth. His unique, privileged relationship with the solitary Philip IV allowed him a degree of artistic freedom that was almost unheard of. The king, who famously allowed Velázquez alone to paint him from life, seemed to value the artist's unflinching honesty. Velázquez extended this same penetrating gaze from the monarch to all the inhabitants of the court, and most remarkably, to its most marginalized members. He painted the court dwarfs not as jesters or pets, but as men. He afforded them the same seriousness, the same psychological depth, and the same complex interiority that he brought to his portraits of the king, the queen, and the chief ministers of the empire. This is most powerfully conveyed through the gaze of his subjects. In a typical court portrait, the subject's gaze is calculated to project power, piety, or aristocratic nonchalance. The dwarfs in Velázquez's portraits do something far more disquieting. They simply look back. Consider his portrait of Sebastian de Mora. The man sits on the floor, a conventional pose meant to emphasize his stature, yet there is nothing subservient in his demeanor. He stares directly out of the canvas, his expression an inscrutable blend of intelligence, resentment, and profound self-possession. It is not a petitioning gaze, it is a challenging one. It compels the viewer to acknowledge him as an equal, a conscious mind appraising the world from his unique vantage point. It is a portrait of a man, not a marvel. Velázquez consistently isolated his subjects, rendering them against dark, ambiguous backgrounds. This compositional choice removes them from the context of courtly spectacle. They are not shown entertaining the infante or standing at the foot of the throne. They are presented alone, forcing the viewer to confront them on their own terms. He often adopted a low point of view, positioning the viewer's eye level with his subjects, a subtle but profound act of empathy. He painted the richness of their velvet and silk clothing, fulfilling the commission's requirement to document a royal possession. But he invested his true effort in capturing the texture of their lived experience. He painted the weariness in their eyes, the intelligence in their brow, the quiet dignity of their posture. In the portrait of Francisco Lazcano we see not a jester, but a pensive, melancholic individual, his mind seemingly a world away from the palace intrigues surrounding him. These portraits were not acts of social protest in a modern sense. They were paintings made for the private consumption of the king and a very small circle of high-ranking courtiers. Yet, within that exclusive context, they were deeply subversive. In a court obsessed with bloodline, status, and physical form, Velázquez asserted that a person's humanity, their anima or soul, resided elsewhere. He used the official instrument of royal propaganda, the state portrait, to create a quiet, enduring testament to the personhood of those the system was designed to objectify. His brushstrokes granted them a permanence under dignity that the court's daily rituals denied. These canvases are the most compelling evidence we have that these were not simple-minded entertainers. They were complex individuals, capable of deep thought and emotion, and it was this very intelligence, so brilliantly captured by Velázquez, that equipped them for their most dangerous and valuable role, that of the truth teller. Beyond the silent companionship they offered in the monarch's private chambers, a select group of court dwarfs performed a more public and perilous function. They inhabited the ancient and paradoxical role of the jester, or buffon. This was not merely a position of entertainment. Within the suffocating formal structure of the Habsburg court, the jester was a crucial, if unofficial, institution. These men, often officially designated as hombres de plaza, men of pleasure, were granted a unique and informal impunity for speech. They possessed what was known as the jester's license, the sanctioned ability to speak truths, mock the powerful, and puncture the balloon of courtly pomposity, all under the fragile protection of humor. This license was an essential social and political pressure valve. In an environment where direct criticism of the monarch or his powerful ministers was tantamount to treason, the jester provided the only permissible outlet for dissent. The mechanism that made this possible was ambiguity. A courtier who stated that a military campaign was poorly conceived would be arrested. A jester, through a clever fable about a lion who sent his sheep to fight wolves, could make the exact same point. The defense was simple and unassailable. It was only a joke. This plausible deniability was the jester's shield. It allowed uncomfortable realities to be aired in the throne room without directly threatening the sacrosanct authority of the king. The speech of the courtier was the language of Ada Lacayon, or flattery. The speech of the jester was the language of satire. The court dwarfs were uniquely suited to this role. Their physical difference already placed them outside the norms of society, marking them as other. This otherness was a prerequisite for the jester, who had to stand apart from the courtly hierarchy in order to critique it. Their perceived harmlessness and the court's tendency to infantilize them provided an additional layer of protection. A cutting remark from a 7-foot-tall courtier was a challenge. The same remark from a 4-foot-tall dwarf could be dismissed as the impertinent but ultimately harmless chatter of a child. This perception, while demeaning, was a tool they learned to wield with extraordinary skill. They perfected the art of couching sharp political commentary and social observation within a veneer of simple-mindedness or playful mockery. The king did not merely tolerate this, he actively required it. Surrounded by a chorus of calculated flattery, the monarch relied on his jesters as one of his only sources of unfiltered information. They were his unofficial auditors of courtly morale and public opinion. Through their jokes, the king could learn what his nobles truly thought of his latest edict, which of his generals was viewed as incompetent, or whether a new tax was causing genuine hardship among the populace. The jesters moved freely between the grand halls and the servants' quarters, gathering gossip and intelligence from all strata of the palace. They were living newspapers, presenting the news not as dry reports, but as witty, memorable, and often bitingly accurate comedy. This was, however, a perilous performance. The jester's license was not a formal legal immunity. It was a privilege granted and sustained solely by the king's personal favor. It required an exceptionally high degree of emotional intelligence to navigate. The successful court jester had to be a master psychologist, capable of reading the monarch's mood in the subtlest shift of his expression. They had to know precisely how far they could push a joke, which subjects were permissible targets, and which were absolutely forbidden. To mock a powerful but temporarily out-of-favor duke might be rewarded with a royal chuckle and purse of coins. To make the same joke when that duke had been restored to the king's good graces could result in a flogging or banishment from court. They were walking a tightrope every day, with royal amusement on one side and ruin on the other. The truths they told were not limited to the political sphere. They were also moral correctives, the only ones permitted to remind the powerful of their own human follies. They mocked vanity, greed, and cowardice, often by name, holding up a distorted mirror to the court's most powerful figures. In doing so, they reinforced the king's position as the ultimate arbiter, the one figure who was, and the ultimate arbiter, the one figure who was, but for all the power they wielded with their words in the open court. Their most potent function was not what they said, but what they silently observed in the rooms where history was being made. While the jester's performance was a public spectacle, designed to be seen and heard, an even more significant source of their influence was derived from the inverse, their capacity for absolute silence and invisibility, but a social and psychological one, cultivated by the prejudices of the court and exploited with quiet acumen by the dwarfs themselves. Their most potent function was not as entertainers, but as unnoticed witnesses during the most confidential and consequential discussions that shaped the fate of the Spanish Empire. They were the ghosts in the machine of Habsburg governance. The nerve center of the king's administration was not the grand throne room, but a series of smaller, private chambers deep within the palace. Here, in the king's private study or in small council rooms, the true business of the state was conducted, where ministers like the count, Duke of Olivares would debate matters of war, finance, and diplomacy with the monarch. It was in these rooms that ambassadors from Rome, Vienna, or London would have their private audiences, where the carefully constructed language of formal diplomacy was replaced by more candid, high-stakes negotiation. The atmosphere was one of intense concentration and guarded speech, where every word was a potential weapon or a weakness to be exploited. And in the corner of the room, on a small stool or cushion, a court dwarf would often be present. The cognitive process that allowed this to happen was a form of profound, systemic dehumanization. To the powerful men gathered in these chambers, the dwarf was not a participant. They were not even an audience. They were, in the most functional sense, part of the furniture. Their presence was a known constant, as unremarkable as the tapestry on the wall or the silver inkstand on the part of the courtiers. This was a critical failure of perception on the part of the courtiers. They saw the small body and the oft-playful title and made the fatal assumption of a small and playful mind. They spoke in front of them with a lack of caution they would never have afforded a common servant, who, despite their lowest recognized, was at least recognized as a fully adult human being with the capacity for comprehension and betrayal. The dwarf was perceived not as a subject with agency, but as an object with presence. This cognitive blind spot transformed them into living repositories of the court's most sensitive information. They listened silently as policy was formulated. They observed the subtle dynamics of power between ministers, noting who held the king's confidence and who was falling out of favor. They absorbed the nuances of foreign policy, hearing the private assessments of ambassadors regarding their own monarch's weaknesses and intentions. They witnessed the king's unvarnished reactions to news from the battlefield or reports of unrest in the provinces, his flicker of anger, his moment of indecision, his sigh of weariness. This was intelligence of a quality that no formal report could ever convey. It was the emotional and psychological subtext of power, the raw data of how the empire was truly run, stripped of all protocol and propaganda. This information was then relayed to the monarch, but not through any official channel. There were no formal debriefings. The transmission was subtle, woven into the fabric of their daily intimacy. It might occur during a quiet game of cards late at night, or while the king was being prepared for bed by his valets. The dwarf might make a seemingly naive comment. The French ambassador did not seem to like the Lord Chancellor today, Your Majesty. He looked at him with a sour face. Childlike observation, delivered without apparent understanding of its import, could convey a crucial piece of diplomatic intelligence more effectively than a lengthy memorandum from a Secretary of State. It gave the king insight without creating a formal accusation. It allowed him to gauge the loyalties and true feelings of his ministers through a deniable, indirect channel. In this capacity, the court dwarfs functioned as the king's most private and effective internal intelligence service. They were an organic listening apparat's most secure environment. Their loyalty was absolute, as their entire existence depended on the king's favor. Unlike professional spies or informants, they had no outside allegiances or independent ambitions. They were, in essence, extensions of the king's own senses, seeing and hearing the things that the shield of majesty would otherwise have made him blind and deaf to. This role as a secret observer was predicated on one irreducible fact: their constant, intimate, and unwavering proximity to the royal body. They were not just in the secret rooms. They were always there, a permanent fixture beside the center of power. The social invisibility that rendered the court dwarfs effective as observers in formal settings was mirrored by their near-constant physical presence in the monarch's most private spaces. They were not merely summoned for audiences or performances. Their existence was woven into the very diurnal rhythm of the king's life. Their role transcended that of a servant, or akin to a living shadow. Where the king went, they followed, a silent, diminutive companion whose presence was as constant and unquestioned as the air in the royal chambers. This unwavering proximity was the bedrock of their unique status, granting them a level of continuous, unfiltered access that was the secret envy of every grandee in the kingdom. The life of the Spanish monarch was a procession of spaces, moving from the public to the private and back again. For every other member of the court, access to these spaces was strictly delineated by rank and function. The gentlemen of the chamber, high-ranking nobles, had the right to be present in the outer private apartments. A smaller, more select group, including the king's confessor and his first physician, could enter the innermost bedchamber, but only at specific, ritually prescribed times. Their presence was always functional, their interactions defined by the formal duties of their office. They entered, performed their task, and departed. The court dwarf operated outside this entire system. They were present before the formal ceremony of the king's waking the levee even began. They were there when the king was a solitary figure in his bed, before the performance of majesty commenced for the day. They remained in the background as the great nobles entered to perform their ritualized roles in the king's dressing. And crucially, they were still there late at night, long after the last courtier had bowed his way out of the royal presence and the chamber doors were sealed. They were witnesses to the king at his most unadorned, both physically and psychologically. They saw him not just in his robes of state, but in his nightshirt. They saw him not just on the throne, but kneeling in his private oratory for his final prayers of the day. This continuous presence transformed them into a form of human furniture, a constant fixture in the royal environment. This state of being was both their greatest humiliation and their greatest strength. Because they were always there, their presence eventually ceased to be noticed in a conscious way. They became part of the baseline state of the king's private world. It was this status, as a living, breathing part of the background scenery, that allowed them to witness the moments of profound vulnerability that no one else was privy to. They saw the king's private grief upon receiving news of a military defeat or the death of a family member. They were present during bouts of the monarch's recurring illnesses, witnessing the frail, mortal body that was concealed beneath the divine right of king. This role as a human shadow served a vital purpose for the monarch's personal security and psychological comfort. In an age of assassination plots and constant political intrigue, the king's bedchamber was the most vulnerable point in the entire state apparatus. The dwarf was a safe presence. Physically non-threatening, they posed no risk of violence. Their absolute dependency ensured their absolute loyalty. To betray the king would be to destroy the source of their own survival. They could be trusted to be in the room while the monarch slept, a pair of watchful eyes whose allegiance was beyond question. They were a living security system more reliable than any armed guard who might harbor their own ambitions or allegiances. More than security, they provided a constant, stable point of human contact in a life of sterile ritual. The silent presence of another being, one who expected nothing and represented no political threat, was a form of psychological ballast. The relationship was profoundly asymmetrical, but it was consistent. In a world where every other interaction was a carefully managed performance, the simple, constant presence of the dwarf was a singular point of reality. This unwavering proximity was not merely a passive state. It was the necessary precondition for a more active and confidential function. A shadow may be silent, but its proximity makes it the perfect vehicle for carrying the secrets of the body that casts it. They were about to evolve from passive companions into active conduits of the king's will. The transition from a passive observer into an active agent was a natural and necessary evolution of the court dwarf's function. Their proven loyalty, born of absolute dependency, and their social invisibility, born of systemic prejudice, made them the ideal solution to one of the most persistent and dangerous problems facing any absolute monarch: secure communication. In the labyrinthine world of the Alcázar, where every wall had ears and every servant was a potential informant, the simple act of conveying a message was fraught with peril. A written note could be intercepted, a verbal message could be misheard or deliberately twisted by a messenger with their own agenda. The king, operating at the center of this web of intrigue, required a channel of communication that was swift, discreet, and above all, utterly reliable. The court dwarf became this channel. They were transformed into the couriers of the court's most sensitive secrets, the living vessels for the whispers and sealed letters that bypassed all official protocol. Their effectiveness in this role was predicated on the very factors that defined their existence. First was their unparalleled freedom of movement. A minister or a high-ranking courtier could not simply walk from the king's wing of the palace to the queen's private apartments without their journey being noted, questioned, and speculated upon. Their every step was scrutinized. A dwarf, however, could traverse the same distance without attracting the slightest attention. Their presence anywhere in the palace was considered normal, their movements aimless and childlike. They could slit through corridors, use servant staircases, and enter private chambers with a casualness that was in itself the perfect disguise. Second was their improvisance to the primary to love courtly intrigue, bribery. A common servant, paid a meager wage, might be tempted by a purse of gold to betray a confidence or sell a secret. A court dwarf had no need for such illicit payments. Their every material need was met by the royal treasury. More importantly, they understood that their privileged position, their very survival, was a gift from the monarch. To be caught in an act of disloyalty would mean an immediate and catastrophic fall from grace, a banishment from the only world they knew. Their allegiance was not a matter of morality, but of pragmatic self-preservation. They were, functionally, incorporeal. This made them the perfect things most clandestine communications. If the monarch needed to send a confidential instruction to his chief minister, bypassing the slow and transparent bureaucracy of the state secretaries, he would not write a formal dispatch. He would instead seal a small note and hand it to a trusted dwarf. The dwarf would conceal it within their clothing and deliver it directly into the minister's hand, ensuring no written record of the order existed in the official archives and that no third party was aware of its transmission. This allowed the king to operate with a layer of plausible deniability, to issue commands and sound out loyalties off the record. Their role was not limited to matters of state. It was perhaps even more crucial in the delicate and often fraught politics of the royal family itself. The marriage of a Spanish Habsburg monarch was a dynastic arrangement, not a romantic one. Communication between the king and queen was oft unfiltered through a host of intermediaries, such as ladies-in-waiting and chamberlains, each with their own loyalties to court factions. Or politically sensitive messages between the royal couple, the dwarf was the only truly secure conduit. They could carry a note, arrange a private meeting, or convey a verbal sentiment with the absolute assurance that its content and tone would not be altered or reported to a rival faction. The most secure form of communication they offered was, of course, the one that left no physical trace. They were often tasked with delivering short, critical messages verbatim. A dwarf would be brought into the king's private study, made to memorize a single sentence, a warning, a query, and then sent to repeat that exact sentence to its intended recipient. The message would be delivered and then cease to exist, living only in the memory of the two principals. The dwarf's perceived intellectual limitations were, paradoxically, an asset in this context. It was assumed they were merely repeating a sound, without fully grasping the strategic import of the words they were carrying. They were a biological encryption device, their mind the temporary container for a secret that would vanish upon delivery. By becoming the trusted carriers of the monarch's most private thoughts, they were inevitably drawn into the orbit of the dynasty's future, the royal nursery. This unparalleled level of trust, essential for the transport of secret messages, found its ultimate expression in the dynasty's most sensitive and zealously guarded domain, the royal nursery. The survival and continuity of the Habsburg line rested entirely on the fragile lives of the royal children, the infantess and infantes. These were not merely children, they were the single most valuable political assets of the empire, the living embodiment of its future. Their environment meticulously controlled to protect them from disease, accident, and above all, malign political influence. It was within this gilded quarantine that the court dwarf was deployed to perform their most intimate and potentially most influential role. The life of a royal child was as lonely and ritualized as that of their monarch parent. From the moment of their birth, they were surrounded by a suffocating apparatus of ceremony. Their days were rigidly scheduled, their play was circumscribed, and their human interactions were carefully vetted. Their companions were not chosen for friendship, but for dynastic suitability. They were surrounded by an army of governesses, tutors, and high-ranking ladies-in-waiting, all of whom were representatives of powerful noble families, each vying for influence over the future ruler. In this environment, a simple, spontaneous moment of childish play was a near impossibility. Every interaction was a lesson, every companion a political placement. The court dwarf offered a unique and necessary antidote to this sterile formality. For a small child, the adult world of the court was a remote and intimidating landscape of towering figures, speaking in hushed, serious tones. The dwarf, by virtue of their physical stature, was immediately more approachable. They existed on the child's own physical level, creating an immediate and disarming sense of familiarity. They were not figures of authority to be obeyed, nor were they servants to be commanded. They occupied a unique third space, that of a playmate. Their official function as hombres de placer extended naturally to the nursery, where their task was to amuse and comfort the royal heir. They would play games, tell stories, and provide a source of constant, stable companionship. This role was far more than simple entertainment. It was a form of psychological guardianship. The dwarf became the child's first confidant, the keeper of their small secrets and the witness to their private tantrums and fears. A deep and genuine bond of affection often formed between the royal children and their diminutive companions, a bond likely more authentic than any they had with the rotating cast of formal tutors and attendants. This relationship is immortalized in the court's official portraiture. We see Prince Balthasar Charles, the heir of Philip IV, painted time and again alongside his favorite dwarfs. Their inclusion in these formal state portraits a testament to their integral role in his daily life. The strategic importance of this placement cannot be overstated. By embedding themselves in the nursery, the dwarfs were making a long-term investment in their own survival and influence. The favor of the current king was a precious but finite resource. By winning the genuine love and trust of the heir, they ensured their position would remain secure for the next generation. The dwarf who had been the beloved companion of the prince's childhood would hold a unique and unassailable position of trust when that prince ascended the throne. They would know the new king's personality, his weaknesses, and his deepest held sentiments better than anyone. Furthermore, they served as the eyes and ears of the king and queen within the nursery's self-contained world. They could observe the conduct of the governesses and tutors, reporting any signs of negligence, cruelty, or most dangerously, the teaching of ideas that ran counter to the parents' wishes. They were a discreet channel of parental oversight in a domain often delegated to others. This integration is most famously and brilliantly captured in Velázquez's masterpiece, Los Meninos. In this complex tableau of court life, the infante Margarita Teresa is the luminous center, and at her side, fully integrated into the intimate scene, are her two dwarf companions, the German Maria Barbola and the Italian Nicolasito Pertuese II. Their presence is not peripheral, it is central. They are not depicted as mere jesters, but as accepted, familiar members of the princess's inner circle. The painting is the ultimate visual document of their success, a snapshot of their complete absorption into the very heart of dynastic life. By becoming the guardians of the children, they move from being stewards of present secrets to being shapers of future power, placing them directly into the crossfire of the court's relentless factional battles. By securing their place at the heart of the royal nursery, the court dwarfs had achieved a position of profound strategic advantage. They were no longer merely the confidants of a single, aging monarch, they had become the companions and shapers of the next generation. This elevated them from simple instruments of the king's will into key pieces on the great chessboard of dynastic succession. As such, they were thrust directly into the merciless, unending crossfire of the court's factional wars. The Spanish court was not a unified body, but a fractured ecosystem of competing interests. Great noble houses, the Guzmanes, the Zuniga-s, the Mendoza-s, along with powerful clerical factions and cliques of secretaries and administrators, wealth and struggle for influence, wealth and power. For these factions, the ultimate prize was control over the monarch, and the battle for the mind of the heir was the most critical front in this war. The court dwarf's position in this conflict was unique in its structural neutrality. Unlike a courtier who was bound by blood, marriage, and patronage to a specific faction, the dwarf's only formal allegiance was to the royal person. They belonged to the House of Habsburg, not the house of any particular noble. This apparent lack of affiliation was their greatest asset, allowing them to move between the warring camps without immediate suspicion. They were perceived as being above politics, a fatal miscalculation by the court's most powerful players who equated political agency with noble title. This perception allowed the dwarfs to become the court's most effective free agents, operating in the spaces between the great power blocks. They became asymmetrical information brokers. A grandee, confident in the dwarf's harmlessness, might voice a frustration or a piece of strategic gossip in their presence, information they would never share with a member of a rival faction. Days later, another noble from an opposing camp might do the very same thing. The dwarf, sitting in silence, became the sole repository of intelligence from both sides of a conflict. They knew who was secretly meeting with whom, who was in debt, who was falling from the king's favor, and who was being considered for a major appointment. They were the central node in an informal intelligence network, gathering the whispers and secrets that were the true currency of the court. This knowledge was rarely deployed in a direct or aggressive manner. To do so would have been suicidal, instantly shattering their protective shield of plausibility. Instead, they manipulated the intricate political landscape through subtlety and insinuation, primarily as a means of self-preservation and, secondarily, for personal advancement. Their primary objective was to protect their proximity to the king and the royal children, which was the source of all their privilege. If a particular minister or faction was perceived as a threat to their position, the dwarf could subtly undermine them. A carefully chosen, seemingly innocent remark to the king, "The Duke of Alba seems so unhappy lately, Your Majesty." He barely smiled all day, could plant a seed of doubt about a powerful noble's loyalty or contentment. It was a poison administered in microscopic, deniable doses. Conversely, they could advance the cause of courtiers who had shown them kindness or whose rise to power would not threaten their own standing. A positive comment, delivered with the same air of naive observation. The Marquis of Castel Rodrigo was so kind to the young prince today. The prince seems to like him very much, could subtly nudge the king's favor in a beneficial direction. They were masters of using the truth as a weapon, selectively reporting accurate observations to shape the monarch's perception of the court around him. The king, in turn, likely understood and utilized this dynamic. He could use his dwarfs as a political barometer, gauging the mood and loyalty of his court. He could even use them to disseminate strategic disinformation, confident that a secret whispered by a dwarf would spread through the palace with the speed of rumor. This was an exceptionally dangerous game. The great nobles of Spain were not fools. While many might have underestimated the dwarfs, a few would have been acutely aware of their unique access and potential influence. To be discovered as a conscious political actor was to make an enemy of some of the most powerful and ruthless men in the kingdom. Their protection rested entirely on the king's personal affection. If a powerful faction could successfully conspire to turn the king against one of them, their fall would be immediate and absolute. They had to navigate this treacherous environment with constant vigilance, balancing the need to protect their position with the mortal risk of overplaying their hand. Their success in this silent, deadly game was not just a matter of political survival, it also yielded tangible, material rewards that defied their official status as mere property. The intricate political maneuvering described, the silent accumulation of secrets, was not an abstract exercise in influence. It was a high-stakes strategy for survival and advancement, and its success was measured in tangible material terms. While their official status within the royal household was one of complete economic dependency, the reality is pieced together from surviving financial ledgers, royal decrees, and the last wills and testaments of a few, paints a far more complex picture. A select group of the most favored court dwarfs, those who succeeded in the perilous game of courtly politics, were able to leverage their unique position to accumulate surprising levels of personal wealth, achieving a degree of economic agency that stood in stark contradiction to their legal classification as human property. The primary source of this wealth was the direct and personal largesse of the monarch. The meticulously recorded provisions, the daily rations, the clothing allowances, were the baseline of their existence. The true rewards came in the form of Mercedes' discretionary grants bestowed by the king as a mark of special favor. These were not part of the formal household budget, but came directly from the king's private purse. A particularly clever joke, a piece of valuable intelligence, or a period of loyal companionship during a royal illness could be rewarded with a gift of gold ducats, a piece of fine jewelry from the royal collection, or a precious object art. These gifts were personal, not institutional, and they were recorded in a way that distinguished them as the private property of the recipient. This stream of income was supplemented by gifts from other members of the royal family. The queen mother, and the royal children to whom the dwarfs were often devoted companions, would also bestow presents upon them. Furthermore, a more subtle and unofficial economy of influence was at play. High-ranking courtiers and foreign ambassadors, fully aware of the dwarfs' intimate access to the monarch, understood the strategic value of their goodwill. While a direct bribe would have been too crude and dangerous, a gift to mark a feast day or a charitable donation to the dwarfs' family back in their home village was a common and effective method of currying favor. For the courtier, it was a small investment to ensure that their name was mentioned positively, or at least not negatively, in the king's private moments. For the dwarf, it was a steady, if undeclared, source of supplementary income. The critical question is what they did with these assets. Their lives were circumscribed by the court, so they could not use their wealth to purchase a country estate or a title. Their agency was expressed in more discreet, but no less significant ways. One of the most common uses of their accumulated capital was to provide for their families of origin. Letters and financial records show them sending regular remittances to their parents and siblings, lifting their relatives out of the poverty they themselves had escaped. This act was not only one of familial duty but also a profound assertion of their own success and status. It reversed the original transaction. The child who had been sold to the court as a dependent was now the family's powerful and wealthy benefactor. Within the palace itself, some became small-scale moneylenders, providing short-term loans at interest to other servants, or even to minor courtiers who found themselves temporarily in debt. This demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of capital and its uses, transforming them from passive recipients of wealth into active financial agents within the palace's microeconomy. The ultimate proof of their economic autonomy, however, is found in the handful of surviving last wills and testaments they left behind. The very existence of such a document was a radical act for an individual legally considered property. In these wills, they bequeathed their personal possessions, jewelry, fine clothing, cash to relatives, to favored fellow servants, or to the church to pay for masses to be said for their souls. This was the final and most definitive expression of ownership and personal agency. This entire economic reality existed in a legal grey area, sustained by the unwritten laws of royal prerogative. The king's favor was the ultimate legal authority, capable of overriding any formal statute. If the king granted a dwarf a purse of gold, that gold became their property, regardless of any legal theory that might classify them as incapable of ownership. They were an anomaly, a special case, and their unique economic status was yet another facet of their exemplarishness. But this accumulation of wealth and influence, visible in the fine jewels on their clothes, and the small retinue of servants who sometimes attended them, did not go unnoticed by the thousands of other courtiers, and what the court noticed, it often grew to resent and to fear. The accumulation of influence, wealth, on royal affection was not a quiet or victimless process. In the ruthlessly competitive, zero-sum ecosystem of the Spanish court, every favor granted to one individual was a favor denied to another. The unique and privileged position of the court dwarfs, while a source of security for them, generated a potent and corrosive byproduct within the courtly body politic, a quiet, pervasive fear. This was not the fear of physical intimidation, but a more insidious anxiety born of resentment, jealousy, and the unnerving suspicion that these human pets held the keys to every courtier's rise or ruin. The most profound source of this resentment was the dwarf's unparalleled access to the monarch. For a Spanish grandee, a lifetime of service, military command, and vast expenditure was undertaken with the singular goal of gaining proximity to the king. An ambitious duke might spend years plotting and maneuvering for a 15-minute private audience. He would then spend that precious time navigating the treacherous currents of protocol, his every word weighed and measured, a source of constant and unbearable psychological friction to witness a dwarf, a person of no lineage and no formal standing, enjoying hours of casual, unfiltered access to the king every single day. They saw the dwarfs sharing jokes with the monarch, playing cards with him late into the night, and even attending to him in his bedchamber. This was an intolerable inversion of the natural order, a daily spectacle that mocked their own heart. One status and made a mockery of the rigid hierarchy upon which their entire world was built. This jealousy of access was compounded by a more straightforward economic resentment. A minor nobleman, a hidalgo with a proud lineage but decayed finances, would have to spend a fortune, He did not have on the mandatory black court attire simply to maintain his position. He might be petitioning for years for a small pension or a minor royal appointment to keep his family solvent, to then see a dwarf, a person he considered a natural fool or a mere plaything, dressed in shimmering silks and velvets paid for by the royal treasury, was a galling and public humiliation. The visible evidence of the dwarf's wealth, the fine clothes, the occasional jewel, their own servants, was a constant reminder of the king's seemingly capricious favor, which appeared to reward a physical anomaly more generously than a lifetime of noble service. Beyond simple jealousy, however, lay a deeper and more potent fear, the fear of the unknown. Courtiers were acutely aware that the dwarfs were present during their most private and sensitive conversations with the king. They knew these silent observers were in the room when they were petitioning for a promotion, slandering a rival, or delivering a carefully edited report from their provincial governorship. They had no way of knowing what the dwarf truly understood, what they might remember, or what they might choose to repeat to the king in a later, more intimate moment. The dwarf became a vessel for every courtier's paranoia. Did the king's sudden coolness towards them stem from a policy disagreement, or from something the dwarf had whispered in his ear the night before? This made the court dwarfs a source of profound and constant anxiety. They were a living, breathing security breach at the heart of every political intrigue. To curry their favor was essential, but also demeaning. To attack them openly was unthinkable, as it would mean attacking the cherished possession of the king himself, a suicidal act of lease. This trapped the courtiers in a state of enforced resentful politeness. They had to smile, to offer pleasantries, and to feign amusement at the dwarf's antics, all while their minds raced with suspicion and fear. This fear was often expressed through back-channel slander and whispered rumor. Courtiers would attempt to poison the dwarfs' reputations, accusing them of being spies for a rival faction, of being greedy, or of secretly mocking the king behind his back. It was a silent, undeclared war, fought with insinuation and malicious gossip. This constant undercurrent of hostility was the price the dwarfs paid for their privileged position. They were simultaneously the most isolated members of the court. They were often protected by the royal family, but they were surrounded by a sea of nobles whose fear and resentment were palpable in every veiled glance and forced smile. They had to navigate their daily lives with an extraordinary degree of emotional and political acuity, knowing that their protectors were few and their potential enemies were legion. This immense psychological pressure, the awareness of being both favored and feared, cherished and despised, is perhaps most powerfully and defiantly expressed on the face of one man, immortalized by Velázquez, whose gaze has become a lasting testament to the intellectual resistance of those who were meant to be nothing more than silent objects. Of all the portraits that serve as primary documents for this hidden history, none is more arresting, more psychologically confrontational, than Velázquez's depiction of Sebastian de Mora, painted around the year 1645. This canvas is more than a masterful work of art. It is a document of profound intellectual resistance, a silent, painted rebellion against the very system of objectification that defined its subject's existence. We find the most compelling visual evidence for the complex interior life and defiant self-awareness of the individuals the court sought to classify as mere amusement. The historical record on Sebastian de Mora is sparse, which makes the psychological density of his portrait all the more significant. We know he was acquired by King Philip IV in 1643, having previously served in the household of the king's brother, the Cardinal, Infante Ferdinand of Austria in Flanders. Upon his arrival at court, he was assigned to the service of the heir, Prince Balthazar Charles, who was himself the subject of many of Velázquez's most famous paintings. Mora's official function would have been that of a playmate and companion to the young prince, a living toy in the royal nursery. This is the official story, the one recorded in the household ledgers. The portrait, however, tells a different story entirely. Velázquez's presents Mora seated directly on the floor, a compositional convention of the time used to emphasize the subject's short stature without the visual distraction of a stool or chair. It is a pose that inherently carries the potential for humiliation, positioning the subject at the feet of the presumed standing viewer. But Velázquez and Mora subvert this convention entirely. Mora is not recumbent or at ease. He sits bolt upright, his posture is steady and rigid control, His legs are planted firmly apart, and his fists are clenched, resting near his hips in a posture of contained power and simmering indignation. There is nothing subservient or playful in this pose. It is grounded, stable, and confrontational. His clothing, a rich costume of green fabric with an expensive red cape and a fine white lace collar, fulfills the portrait's official purpose, to document a valuable possession of the print. But the finery serves only as a bitter counterpoint to the man's face. It is here that the true act of defiance occurs. Mora's gaze is directed squarely at the viewer. It is not the deferential, averted glance of a servant, nor the vacant stare of a simpleton. An intensely intelligent look. His brow is furrowed, his expression is one of utter seriousness, bordering on contempt. It is the gaze of a man who is fully aware of his circumstances, of how he is being seen, and who refuses to participate in the charade. He does not ask for pity or offer amusement. He challenges, he appraises, he judges the viewer in return. Velázquez isolates him against a dark, featureless background, stripping away all context of the palace. There is no hint of a throne room, no tapestry, no architectural detail. This is a deliberate artistic choice that removes Mora from his official role as a court fixture and forces the viewer to confront him as an individual. The focus is entirely on his presence, his undeniable and forceful personhood. The artist's slow viewpoint places the viewer on Mora's level, preventing us from literally looking down on him. We meet his gaze as an equal. This portrait is a collaboration. It is Velázquez's genius that provides the framework of radical dignity, but it is Mora's own self-possession that animates the canvas. He is an active participant in the creation of his own image, projecting a formidable intelligence and a deep-seated resentment at his gilded captivity. The painting becomes a testament to the internal struggle of a man forced into the role of a buffoon, a man whose mind was clearly his own, who refused to be reduced to his physical form. He is the living embodiment of the court sphere, the silent observer who was not only watching and listening, but also understanding, analyzing, and forming his own judgments. While Sebastian de Mora's portrait is a document of fierce, confrontational intelligence, the canvases depicting his contemporaries reveal other, equally complex modes of survival and interior life within the suffocating confines of the court. Where Sebastian de Mora's portrait is a study in fiery confrontation, another canvas by Velázquez, created around the same period, offers a starkly different and profoundly melancholic vision of this hidden world. It is the portrait of Francisco Lizcano, another of the dwarfs in the service of Prince Balthasar Charles. The work is traditionally known by the title El Niño de Velázquez, the child of Velázquez, a name assigned to it in a later palace inventory, though archival evidence confirms the subject's name and indicates he was of Basque origin. If Mora's survival strategy was defiance, Lizcano's appears to have been a quiet, psychological retreat into a world of his own, a form of internal exile captured by the painter with devastating empathy. Surviving records tell us that Francisco Lizcano entered the prince's service in 1634. Like his peers, he was provided with lavish clothing, and the royal accounts meticulously detail expenditures for his suits of velvet and fine cloth. The painting, however, strips away any sense of courtly grandeur. Velázquez places Lizcano not within a palace chamber, but outdoors, seated amidst a stark, rocky landscape that suggests the rugged Sierra de Guadarrama mountains outside Madrid. He holds a deck of playing cards in his hands, a common attribute for a court entertainer. But he is not engaged with them. He absently thumbs one card with his right hand, but his gaze is directed elsewhere, past the viewer, into a middle distance. It is an unfocused, vacant look, one of somber introspection rather than intellectual disability. Unlike Mora, Lizcano does not challenge the viewer. In fact, he seems entirely unaware of our presence. His body is turned toward us, but his mind is elsewhere. Velázquez captures a state of profound psychological absence. The cards, symbols of his official function as a plaything, lie idle in his lap. They are a prop he is required to hold, but they are irrelevant to the true subject of the painting, which is the man's internal state. This is not the portrait of a jester caught in a moment of repose. It is the portrait of a consciousness adrift, a mind that has withdrawn from the immediate reality of its surroundings as a mechanism of endurance. The historical context of the painting deepens its pathos. In 1645, the same year this work was likely painted, Lescano accompanied the 16-year-old Prince Balthasar Charles on a military expedition to Zaragoza. The king intended for his heir to witness the campaign to recapture the city of Leda from the French. The presence of Lescano on such a journey, far from the cloistered safety of the Madrid Alcázar, is a powerful testament to his role as the prince's constant, indispensable shadow. He was not just a nursery playmate, but a permanent fixture in the heir's life, present even in the context of a military encampment. The rugged outdoor setting of the portrait is almost certainly a reference to this journey, painted from life or from memory during or shortly after the campaign. It depicts Lescano not as a palace ornament, but as a traveler, a small figure set against a vast and indifferent landscape, a visual metaphor for his own internal isolation. The final, crucial piece of evidence that unlocks the portrait's meaning comes from a single, stark entry in the palace archives. A document from 1649 which records a salary payment notes that Francisco Lescano suffered from goteca duca, the contemporary term for epilepsy. This medical diagnosis contextualizes the entire painting. The vacant, withdrawn expression, the psychological absence, these are nautical absence. These are not artistic metaphors for courtly alienation. They are very likely the clinical and empathetic observations of a masterful artist depicting the neurological reality of his subject. Velázquez may be capturing the aftereffects of a seizure, the mental fog known as the postictal state, or simply the pervasive melancholy that often accompanies the condition. Viewed through this lens, the portrait becomes an act of profound humanization. Velázquez refuses to paint the jester or the medical curiosity. Instead, he paints someone defined by his inner struggle, his consciousness shaped by a condition beyond his control. He grants Lescano a complex intuitivity that the court, in its casual cruelty, would have denied him. Francisco Lescano's portrait stands as a quiet counterpoint to Sebastian de Mora's. One man survives by pushing back against the world with a defiant intellect, the other survives by retreating from it. Both canvases reveal the lie at the heart of the court's perception of these individuals. They were not simpletons or toys. They were complex human beings navigating an impossible existence, each finding their own way to endure, and some, like the two figures at the center of the court's most famous painting, endured by becoming an inseparable part of the royal family's public and private image. No single image captures the intricate reality of the court dwarf's existence more completely than Diego Velázquez's monumental 1656 masterpiece, Los Meninas, The Maids of Honor. The painting is a complex, enigmatic meditation on art, reality, and the nature of observation, set within the artist's own studio in the Madrid Alcázar. At its heart, it is a portrait of a specific moment in the life of the 5-year-old infante Margarita Teresa and her retinue. It serves as the ultimate visual summation of the themes we have explored: the dwarfs' complete integration into the royal household, their intimate relationship with the royal children, and the nuanced, distinct roles they played within that rarefied world. Within this single canvas we find not one, but two case studies presented as a deliberate and insightful pairing. On the right side of the composition, balancing the formal ladies-in-waiting who give the painting its name, stand Marie Barbola and Nicolásito Pertuis II. Their presence is not incidental or marginal. They are key figures in the complex human tableau that surrounds the young princess. They are not positioned behind or below the nobles, but alongside them, an integral part of the infant as immediate circle. Velázquez, with his characteristic psychological acuity, depicts them not as a generic pair of dwarfs, but as two distinct individuals performing two different, yet complementary functions. In stark contrast to Hearst's illness, Nicolásito Pertuis II, who was of Italian origin, is a figure of dynamic action. He is shown in profile, his body angled as he playfully nudges a large, sweeping mastiff with his foot. It is the only moment of overt, spontaneous action in an otherwise posed and static scene. While everyone else seems frozen in a moment of form observation, Nicolásito is engaged in an act of childish mischief, attempting to rouse the gentle beast from its slumber. This single gesture perfectly encapsulates the other primary function of the court dwarf in the nursery, that of the entertainer, the instigator of play, the one permitted to disrupt the suffocating formality of the environment. If Maria Barbola represents order, Nicolásito represents the sanctioned chaos of childhood. He is the hombre de plaza, the playmate whose job it is to inject life and amusement into the princess's regimented day. The deliberate juxtaposition of these two figures is a work of genius. Velázquez is showing his audience that the term court dwarf does not describe a monolithic role, but a spectrum of duties. Together, Barbola and Pertuis to form a complete psychological support system for the infante. They provide both the quiet companionship of a guardian and the boisterous energy of a playmate. They are the twin pillars of her immediate intimate world. Their inclusion in this, one of the most important royal portraits of the era, is the final, irrefutable proof of their status. They are not hidden away or brought out for special occasions. They are a constant, central, and accepted part of the fabric of daily royal life. Their presence also serves to magnify the status of the infante. To be surrounded by such a diverse and exotic retinue, Spanish ladies-in-waiting, a German attendant, an Italian playmate, was a visual testament to the global reach and immense wealth of the Spanish crown. They are, on one level, still functioning as high-status possessions. Yet, Velázquez's humanizing portrayal, his careful delineation of their distinct personalities and roles, elevates them far beyond that. They are not interchangeable objects, but individuals who hold a specific, meaningful, and clearly cherished place in the emotional life of the future empress. While Los Meninas captures the quiet, domestic side of their lives, other individuals specialized in a more public and satirical form of performance, even daring to mock the most celebrated figures of the empire, while the intimate, domestic roles performed by Maria Barbola and Nicolásito Pertuis to represent one end of the functional spectrum. The court also cultivated a more public, performative, and politically charged type of court dwarf, the satirical jester. The playful mischief of Nicolásito Pertuis too, nudging a sleeping dog, was a private amusement for the infante. When that same impulse was sharpened into a political tool and deployed in the full view of the court, it became an instrument of immense power, capable of shaping reputations and managing the legacies of even the empires. Most illustrates this more vividly than that of the jester who was given the most audacious and ironic nickname in the entire Spanish court, Don John of Austria. To grasp the staggering audacity of this naming, one must first understand the monumental figure of the original Don John of Austria. He was the illegitimate son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and the half-brother of King Philip II. A figure of immense charisma, military genius, and romantic legend, Don John was the great martial hero of his age. In 1571, he commanded the fleet of the Holy League at the Battle of Lepanto, a cataclysmic naval engagement that resulted in a decisive victory over the Ottoman Empire. This victory was hailed across Christendom as a miraculous deliverance, and Don John became, overnight, the living sword of the faith, the savior of Europe. His popularity was immense, his prestige almost rivaling that of the king himself. It was precisely this towering, heroic stature that made the court's satirical appropriation of his name so potent. Sometime in the late 16th or early 17th century, a court dwarf whose original name is now lost to the official record was formally given the title of Don John of Austria. This act of naming was, in itself, a sophisticated and ruthless exercise in political theatre. Every time this man was summoned, every time he was announced upon entering a room, the legendary name of the hero of Lepanto was spoken, but it was attached to a diminutive figure whose function was to provoke laughter. It was a constant, living, breathing act of symbolic deflation. The central mechanism of the joke was the grotesque physical and situational irony. The court would witness this new Don John performing mock battles, perhaps armed with a wooden sword and a pot lid for a shield. He would strut and posture, mimicking the heroic stances seen in triumphal portraits of his namesake. His performance was a parody of martial glory, a satirical commentary on the very nature of heroism. The contrast between the celebrated historical deeds and the comical, small-scale reenactment was a source of immense amusement for the courtiers, but beneath the laughter lay a much more serious political purpose. The real Don John of Austria, for all his loyalty, had been a source of considerable anxiety for his half-brother, Philip II. His immense popularity and personal ambition were seen as a potential threat to the stability of the throne. After his death, it was politically useful for the crown to subtly manage and contain his legacy. The jester Don John became the perfect instrument for this, living reminder that even the greatest of heroes was ultimately subject to the king's authority and, by extension, to the court's ridicule. The jester's performance kept the legend of Don John from growing too large, too independent, too divine. They tethered the myth back to earth with the inescapable gravity of parody. It was a demonstration of the monarch's ultimate power, the power to define and even mark the history that his own family had written. This figure, so masterfully captured in a portrait now housed in the Prado Museum, though its attribution to Velázquez is debated, is shown in full, albeit mismatched, military regalia, a symbol of his parodic function. He stands as the ultimate embodiment of the jester's license, a man whose physical harmlessness allowed him to engage in an act of political and historical commentary that would have been unthinkable for any nobleman. He was a weapon of soft power, deployed to regulate the narrative of the state. He was an active agent, a performer who used his intellect and wit to shape the perceptions of those around him. This active, influential role, however, stands in the starkest possible contrast to the fate of other human marvels who were brought to court not for their minds, but solely for the spectacle of their bodies. This active, intellectual agency, this capacity to shape and satirize the official narrative of the state, was not, however, a privilege extended to all individuals of unusual physicality who were brought into the court's orbit. To fully comprehend the unique alchemy of factors that allowed the court dwarfs to achieve their hidden influence, we must examine the crucial counterpoint, the case of those whose physical condition was deemed suitable only for pure spectacle, devoid of any potential for intimacy, intellect or agency. Their story serves as a vital control group, reminding us that the court's fascination with the unnatural did not always lead to a place by the king's side. For some, the gilded cage had no hidden doors. The most poignant and well-documented example of this reality is the story of Eugenia Martinez Vallejo, known to the court of King Charles II by the stark and brutal sobriquet La Monstrue. Eugenia was brought to the Madrid court around 1680, when she was approximately 6 years old. She came from a village in the province of Burgos, and the reason for her acquisition was singular: her extraordinary size. From a very young age, Eugenia exhibited a condition that resulted in what was then termed prodigious obesity. While a modern diagnosis is impossible, her portrait strongly suggests a congenital endocrine disorder, possibly Prader-Willi syndrome. To the court of the late 17th century, however, she was simply a marvel of nature, a human prodigy whose sheer mass was a source of astonishment and morbid curiosity. Unlike the dwarfs, whose value was multifaceted, Eugenia's was singular and entirely visual. She was brought to court for one purpose only: to be looked at. Her role was that of a living exhibit. She was paraded before visiting dignitaries and displayed during court festivities, her body serving as a source of wonder and conversation. There is no historical record suggesting that she was a confidant to the queen, a playmate to a royal heir, or a witty jester. She was an object, a piece of the royal collection of natural IA, different from a stuffed crocodile or a giant seashell only in that she was alive. The ultimate proof of her status lies in the two famous portraits of her commissioned by the king from the court painter, Juan Carreno de Miranda. These two canvases, intended to be displayed as a pair, are a chilling and clinical study in objectification. The first portrait, La Monstrue Vest Ida, the Perthed Monster, depicts Eugenia in a sumptuous red and white formal gown, the type of dress worn by an infante or a high-ranking lady of the court. But to create a jarring and grotesque contrast, the delicate fashionable attire is stretched and distorted by the immense body it contains. The intended effect for the 17th century viewer was one of comical incongruity, the parody of courtly elegance. She holds a delicate piece of fruit, a further ironic counterpoint to her size. Her expression is passive, her gaze listless, conveying a sense of weary resignation. She is not a participant in her own portrayal, she is a mannequin, displayed for effect. The second portrait, La Monstrue Desnuda, the nude monster, is even more brutal in its objectification. Here, she is depicted in the allegorical guise of Bacchus, the Roman god of wine and excess. She is unclothed, her body fully exposed, holding a cluster of grapes. The classical illusion is a thin, almost cruel veneer. Unidealized nudes of Renaissance and Baroque tradition, this is a frank, unflinching, and non-idealized depiction of her flesh. It is not a celebration of the human form, but a medicalized documentation of a physical anomaly. This painting was not for public display but for the king's private collection, a piece of verism that allowed her body to be studied and marveled at away from the public eye. The stark case of Eugenia Martinez Vallejo serves as a crucial marker, defining the absolute outer boundary of the court's interest in human anomalies. She was a spectacle, an object, and nothing more. Yet, even for the most successful and integrated court dwarfs, those who became confidants, agents, and companions to royalty, there existed a similar, albeit far more subtle and complex, set of insuperable barriers. Their influence, while undeniably real and potent within the palace's inner sanctum mess, was ultimately contained by an unbreakable glass ceiling of status. They could press their faces against it, see the world of true, institutionalized power operating just above them, but they could never, under any circumstances, pass through it. The first and most fundamental limitation was the strict division between informal influence and formal authority. The dwarfs' power was entirely derivative, flowing from a single source, their personal relationship with the monarch. They could whisper in the king's ear, shape his perceptions, guide his favor, and undermine their enemies through subtle insinuation. This was the very definition of influence. What they could not do, however, was exercise authority. They could not sign a royal decree. They could not issue a formal command to even the lowliest palace guard. They could not sit on any of the great councils of state, the Council of Castile, the Council of the Indies, where the actual bureaucratic work of governing the empire was done. Their name never appeared on an official government document as anything other than a recipient of a household allowance. A powerful minister like the Count, Duke of Olivares, could levy taxes, dispatch armies, and appoint governors. A powerful court dwarf could, at best, persuade the king to have Olivares do these things. The distinction is critical. They were advisors, not actors, catalysts, not agents. The second barrier was social and biological, and it was absolute. The entire edifice of the Spanish aristocracy, upon which the court was built, rested on the twin pillars of bloodline, lineage, and purity of blood, limpis et sanguine. Power was hereditary. Status was a matter of genealogy. The dwarfs, by their very nature, were excluded from this system. They were defined by their physical condition, which was seen as a random, and often unfortunate, quirk of nature. It was not a heritable trait in the same way that a ducal title was. They could never marry into the nobility. Such a union was a social and genetic impossibility, an unthinkable pollution of a carefully curated bloodline. This automatically barred them from the primary means of social and political advancement in early modern Europe, the strategic alliance of families through marriage. They were, and would always remain, sui generis, one of a kind, a class of their own, forever outside the intricate web of kinship that constituted the true power structure of the kingdom. This leads to the third and most precarious boundary, the radical contingency of their position. A duke's power was rooted in his ancestral lands, his titles, and his network of family retainers. While he could fall from royal favor, he would still remain the Duke of Alba or the Duke of Medina Sidonia. His status had a permanence that transcended his relationship with any individual king. The power of the court dwarf, in contrast, had no such foundation. It was built entirely on the fragile, shifting sands of the monarch's personal affection. Their entire world, their luxurious clothing, their comfortable lodgings, their economic security, their political influence, their very safety from the resentful courtiers who surrounded them, depended on the continued goodwill of one person. This made their existence a constant, high-wire act of psychological maintenance. They had to be perpetually amusing, forever loyal, and ceaselessly vigilant against the plots of their enemies. A loyal tantrum, A momentary lapse in judgment, a successful slander campaign by a rival, could erase their entire life's work in an instant. The most definitive threat, however, was the simple fact of royal mortality. When their patron, the king or the prince they had served since childhood, died, their protection died with him. The new monarch would have his own favorites, his own established relationships. The dwarfs of the old regime were, at best, sentimental relics of a bygone era. At worst, they were seen as sinister influences from the past, to be purged along with the old king's ministers and policies. They had no institutional role to fall back on, no title to protect them. Their fate now in the hands of a new master who felt no personal bond of affection or loyalty toward them. For those who lost this precarious game, the fall from grace was not a gentle decline. It was a swift, silent, and often total disappearance from the historical record. The favor of a king, the ultimate currency of the court, was not a gentle blessing. It was a crushing weight, a relentless and demanding force that exacted a severe and largely invisible price from those who possessed it. The court dwarfs, whose entire existence was predicated on achieving and maintaining this favor, lived in a state of perpetual psychological strain. Their gilded cage, while materially comfortable, was a crucible designed to test the absolute limits of human emotional and mental endurance. To live as both a confidant and a captive, a cherished pet and a political tool, was to exist in a state of profound and corrosive cognitive dissonance. The mental toil of this life was the unwritten entry in the royal ledgers, the hidden cost of their privileged survival. The most constant pressure was that of performance. Their role as hombres de place was not a 9-to-5 occupation. It was a totalizing state of being. From the moment they entered the king's presence in the morning until they departed late at night, they were expected to be on. They had to be amusing but not impertinent, witty but not arrogant, comforting but not familiar. This required a continuous and exhausting act of self-monitoring. They had to perpetually read the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in the monarch's mood, adjusting their own demeanor in an instant. A joke that would have been rewarded with a laugh on a good day could be met with a cold stare of disapproval on a bad one. They were emotional chameleons, forced to suppress their own feelings, their fatigue, their sadness, their own private anxieties, in order to perfectly mirror and manage the psychological state of their royal master. This was not simple entertainment. It was a sophisticated, unrelentless form of emotional labor. Beyond performance, they carried the silent burden of the king's own psychological turmoil. As established, the monarch's life was one of profound isolation. The dwarf was his only safe outlet, the one person to whom he could express the frustrations, fears, and rages that had to be concealed from the world of formal politics. The dwarf thus became the king's emotional sump. They absorbed the royal anger after a council meeting went poorly. They listened to the king's private grief over the death of a child, a grief he could not display publicly with what was considered appropriate restraint. They were the silent witnesses to the monarch's deepest anxieties about the state of the empire or the loyalty of his own family. To be the sole custodian of these high-stakes emotions was a heavy and dangerous responsibility. They had to take on the king's burdens without showing the strain, to be a stable and calming presence even when the information they were receiving was terrifying. This unique intimacy was paired with an equally unique and profound isolation. They were in the court, but not of it. They were despised by them as upstart rivals for the king's affection. They were set apart from the general servants by their privileged status and their physical difference. They could form no true peer group. They had no one with whom they could share the burden of their unique position. Their one intimate relationship was with the monarch, a bond that was grotesquely asymmetrical, a mixture of genuine affection, absolute dependency, and the ever-present dynamic of owner and property. This created a specific and agonizing form of loneliness, the loneliness of being a secret keeper, surrounded by people yet unable to truly connect with any of them. This entire existence was underpinned by a constant, low-frequency hum of fear, the hypervigilance required to navigate the court's factional politics, to avoid the traps set by resentful courtiers, and to maintain the king's favor would have been mentally debilitating. They were living in a perpetual state of threat assessment, analyzing every glance, every whispered conversation, for signs of danger. The ultimate fear, however, was that of abandonment. Their position was radically contingent. It depended entirely on the life and mood of a single human being. The thought of the king's death, or a sudden inexplicable withdrawal of his favor, would have been a source of constant existential dread. This combination of pressures, the need to perform, the emotional burden, the profound isolation, and the constant fear, created a psychological environment that was fundamentally unsustainable. For those who made a single misstep, or who were simply the victims of changing political tides, the fall was not a metaphor. It was a sudden, brutal, and terrifying reality. The psychological burdens and constant political vigilance required for survival in the Habsburg court were not theoretical exercises. They were practical daily necessities, and failure to meet these demands had consequences that were immediate, irreversible, and absolute. For those court dwarfs who lost their footing on the precarious tightrope of royal favor, the fall from grace was not a gradual decline into irrelevance. It was a swift, silent, and near total erasure from the world they had inhabited. The same system that had elevated them to a position of unprecedented intimacy was ruthlessly efficient in their disposal, demonstrating the ultimate truth of their existence. They were cherished possessions, unlike any possession that had broken or fallen out of fashion. They could be discarded without ceremony. The mechanics of this fall were varied, but they typically fell into one of three categories. The first and most direct was a personal breach that exhausted the monarch's indulgence. The jester's license, as established, was a fragile privilege, not a formal immunity. A dwarf, perhaps grown overconfident with years of favor, might misread the king's mood, push a joke too far, or make a satirical comment that struck a nerve of genuine royal insecurity. What was amusing one day could be perceived as insolent the next. In other cases, the breach might be a perceived act of disloyalty, such as being caught consorting too closely with a known member of a rival court faction. In these instances, the monarch's affection, which was their only shield, could curdle into suspicion and anger in an instant. The second path to ruin was through the successful machinations of their enemies. The quiet fear and resentment they inspired among the nobility was a constant, simmering threat. A powerful courtier, after years of being subtly undermined or simply having his status mocked by the dwarf's proximity to the king, might finally succeed in a plot to discredit them. This could involve framing the dwarf for a minor theft, orchestrating a situation where they appeared disloyal, or, most effectively, planting a series of poisonous rumors with the king's confessor or other trusted officials. Lacking a noble family or a powerful faction to defend them, the dwarf was exceptionally vulnerable to such targeted attacks. Once the seed of doubt was planted in the king's mind, it was almost impossible to root out. The third and most common cause of their fall, however, was entirely impersonal. It was the simple, unavoidable fact of dynastic change. A dwarf's entire career and security were typically tied to a single patron, the king, the queen, or royal child. When that patron died, their world dissolved. A new monarch ascending to the throne brought with them their own household, their own confidants, and their own household, their own favorites established over years as the heir apparent. At best, ghosts of a past administration. They were physical reminders of a dead king's affections, and their continued presence could be seen as an unwelcome intrusion. The new regime, eager to establish its own identity, would quietly on guard, and the dwarfs, lacking any formal, institutional role, were often the first to be cleared away. The process of their removal was characterized by its quiet, bureaucratic brutality. There was no formal trial, no public denunciation. The first sign would be the denial of access. The guards at the entrance to the royal chambers would, without explanation, no longer permit them to enter. Then, their privileges would be revoked. The royal tailors would receive no new commissions for them. The kitchens would cease to deliver their special rations. Finally, they would be physically removed from the court. The luckiest might be granted a small pension and sent to live in a distant monastery or a convent, a form of comfortable exile. Others might be sent back to the families who had sold them decades earlier, returning as strangers to a world they no longer knew. The unluckiest and those who had committed the most serious transgressions simply vanished. Their names ceased to appear in any household records, their fate unrecorded and unknown. For a person whose entire identity had been constructed within the palace walls, this expulsion was not just a loss of status, it was a form of social death. It was a terrifying reminder that their influence, however potent, was never truly their own. And what could happen to an individual could, in time, happen to the institution itself. The entire tradition was as contingent on the tastes of one dynasty as a single dwarf was on the tastes of one dynasty, as a single dwarf was on the tastes of one king. The fall of a single court dwarf from the precarious heights of royal favor was a personal tragedy, a quiet and brutal erasure of an individual's world. This process, however, was a microcosm of the larger, systemic extinction that awaited the tradition itself. The entire institution, so deeply embedded in the culture of the Spanish Habsburgs for nearly 2 centuries, was as radically contingent on the survival of that dynasty as a single dwarf was on the life of their king. When the dynasty faltered and fell, the unique ecological niche that had allowed these figures to flourish and wield their hidden power vanished along with it. The precipitating event was a biological undynastic failure that had been looming for decades. On November 1st, 1700, King Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, died without an heir. His death triggered a cataclysmic, continent-spanning conflict known as the War of the Spanish Succession. At its conclusion, the throne of Spain passed from the House of Habsburg to the House of Bourbon, in the person of Philip V, the grandson of the great paradigm of European monarchy, King Louis XIV of France. With the arrival of Philip V and his French entourage in Madrid, it was not merely a new king who took power, but an entirely new cultural, aesthetic, and political philosophy. The court that the Bourbons established was a deliberate and systematic rejection of the one they replaced. Where the Habsburg court was a somber, quasi-monastic cloister governed by the rigid and arcane Burgundian Ceremonial, the Bourbon model was a ballroom. It was based on the dazzling, public, and highly performative court of Versailles. The aesthetic of the Habsburgs was fundamentally Baroque, a fascination with shadow, complexity, intense piety, and the mirabilia, the marvelous, the strange, the exceptional prodigies of nature that spoke of God's mysterious power. The court dwarf was a perfect expression of this worldview. The Bourbon aesthetic, by contrast, was rooted in French neoclassicism and the nascent rationalism of the Enlightenment. It valued order, symmetry, clarity, reason, and an idealized, classical vision of beauty. The court of Versailles was not an inward-looking theatre of gravity, but an outward-projecting spectacle of magnificence. In this new cultural landscape, the court dwarf was an anachronism, an embarrassment, and distinctly un-French past. The tradition of collecting human marvels was viewed not as a sophisticated expression of power, but as a crude and morbid curiosity, unbecoming of a modern, rational monarch. The change was not immediate and violent, but it was decisive. Philip V and his successors had no interest in the strange, intimate psychological dependencies that had defined their Habsburg predecessors. Their model of kingship was one of magnificent distance, not of cloistered familiarity. The procurement networks that had once scoured Europe for suitable candidates fell dormant. No new acquisitions were made. The existing court dwarfs, now aging reminders of a defunct dynasty, were greeted with a kind of benign neglect. Their roles were not renewed. Many were granted pensions and allowed to retire quietly, either within the palace or in religious houses. They were no longer a central, visible feature of daily court life. This shift in taste is vividly reflected in the art of the period. The probing, psychologically intense realism of Velázquez, which found such profound humanity in the court's most marginalized figures, gave way to the more formal, decorative, and idealized styles favored by the Bourbon monarchy. The new court painters, influenced by French masters, were commissioned to paint grand allegories, elegant equestrian portraits, and light-hearted Rococo scenes. There was no place in this artistic worldview for the confrontational gaze of a Sebastian de Mora or the melancholy introspection of a Francisco Lescano. The dwarfs, both as individuals and as artistic subjects, simply faded from the picture. The institution, therefore, did not die by the sword, but from a quiet and profound change in taste. It was a death by obsolescence. The unique conditions that had allowed it to thrive, a dynasty of isolated, introspective monarchs, a court culture fascinated by the exceptional, and a political system that had space for informal, hidden channels of influence, were all swept away by the tide of the 18th century. The gilded cage was dismantled, not out of any sense of moral progress, but because the new owners of the palace simply had a different aesthetic preference for its decor. The dwarfs themselves, now unmoored from the only structure that had ever given their lives meaning, vanished into the footnotes of history, leaving behind them a strange and silent legacy, preserved almost exclusively in the cold, unblinking gaze of the portraits that still hung on the palace walls. And so the voices fell silent. The padded footsteps that had once echoed in the private corridors of the Alcázar faded, leaving no official trace of the secrets they had carried or the counsel they had offered. The institution, a unique and complex human ecosystem that had flourished for nearly 200 years, did not end with a decree or a formal dissolution. It simply ceased to be relevant, a cultural practice that expired alongside the dynasty that had cultivated it, when the last of the Habsburg era dwarfs drew their final breath, a whole universe of unspoken knowledge of kings' fears, queens' sorrows, and the quiet truths of power died with them. What remains is not a chronicle written by their own hands, for they were permitted none. What remains is a ghostly, unambiguous after-image, preserved almost entirely within the quiet, gilded frames that now line the solemn galleries of the Prado Museum in Madrid. This is the final, profound irony of their story. A group of individuals whose primary function was to be seen, whose entire lives were a form of spectacle, have achieved a kind of immortality precisely through that visual record. But the record is not one of their own making. It is the testimony of an observer, albeit a uniquely empathetic one. Without the brush of Diego Velázquez, and to a lesser extent other court painters like Juan Carreno de Miranda, these men and women would be little more than names in a household ledger, itemized expenses alongside entries for velvet, wine, and horses. The paintings are all that is left. They are the primary sources, the only truly substantive evidence of this hidden history. Visiting the Prado today is a strange and disquieting experience. In one gallery hangs the magnificent, somber state portraits of King Philip IV, his face a mask of Habsburg gravity, the very image of absolute power. And then in another room, one comes face to face with Sebastian de Mora, Francisco Ascano, or the jester known as Don John of Austria. The visual power of these portraits is undiminished by the centuries. They still command the space. Their gazes still follow the viewer, demanding recognition, challenging the official narrative presented by the portraits of their royal masters. The museum, a temple to the official history of the Spanish state, unwittingly becomes the site of a silent, unresolved confrontation. The king's story hangs on one wall, but the dwarf's story hangs on another, and the latter seems to whisper a potent, contradictory truth about the nature of the first. These portraits are the last echoes, the final, faint signal from a world that has otherwise vanished completely. They are historical documents of a peculiar and powerful kind, offering us a window into the psychological reality that the written archives ignore. They allow us to see the intelligence that the court sought to deny, the dignity that the system sought to erase, and the profound melancholy that was the inevitable price of their gilded captivity. They are a testament to the fact that even within the most rigid and dehumanizing of structures, the human spirit endures, adapts, and finds its own unique and unexpected pathways to agency and influence. The story of the court dwarfs of the Spanish Habsburgs is not, in the end, a story about the curious customs of a bygone era. It is a timeless and unsettling parable about the complex relationship between power and powerlessness, between the seen and the unseen, and about the deep, often desperate, human need for unfiltered truth, a need that can sometimes only be met by those who have been placed entirely outside the system. And so we must leave them there, frozen in Velázquez's amber, their expressions locked in a permanent, silent conversation with the ages. Their specific world has vanished, its unique blend of piety, cruelty, and psychological need dissolved by the changing tastes of history. But the dynamics they mastered have not. The quiet influence of the overlooked, the power of proximity, the uncomfortable truth spoken by those with nothing to lose. These are not artifacts of the 17th century. They are constants in the architecture of human power, recurring in different forms in corporate boardrooms, political backrooms, and the private chambers of the influential. The stage is different, the costumes have changed, but the roles remain remarkably the same. The tale is concluded, preserved as a warning. A warning that is seldom heeded. Farewell.